We're going to be doing first a review of the material, and then we're going to go over some key vocabulary, and we'll do some practice questions at the end, just so you guys can practice and make sure that you guys get everything straight. So we'll start with the review. Um, so for Module 74, social psychology is the study of how we act differently by focusing on situations. This is pretty much the whole unit, what the whole unit is about, so you guys should be very aware with what the definition of social psychology is. So a very important part of social psychology is the attribution theory, is when we explain someone's behavior by crediting the situation or disposition. And a fundamental attribution error is the tendency to underestimate the impact of the situation. So basically, when there's a situation that arises, people tend to underestimate the impact of a social situation and tend to blame mostly individual characteristics for the reason why certain situations go a certain way. And this appears more in individualistic cultures, like America, for example, is a very individualistic culture. Um, and we tend to explain our own bad behavior with situations and our own good behavior with predispositions. So this is a great example of the fundamental attribution error, where we don't want to take blame for things that we do that end up wrong or end up doing things that are bad. And so we blame those things on the situation. Like, oh, I didn't do well on this test. It was probably because maybe the temperature was off in the room that I was taking it in. And you want to like attribute your good behavior with predisposition. So you say, oh, I did well on the test because I studied hard for it. So that's a good example of the fundamental attribution error. But for other people, we tend to explain other people's bad behavior using the fundamental attribution error by saying that, oh, that person did this thing because they are a bad person, not because of the situation, or yeah. So that's a great example of the fundamental attribution error. And so attitudes are feelings that predispose us to respond in a particular way. So attitudes affect actions and actions affect attitudes. So you might respond to a certain comment that a friend makes to you in one way if you're feeling happy versus another way if you're feeling angry. So just in general, like your mental state, like the state of mind that you're in a certain situation will affect the way that you respond to those. And then the way you respond to those situations will also in turn affect your state of mind. So peripheral route persuasion is when people respond to incidental cues. So a great example of this is celebrity endorsements, something that just like plays into like your emotional side of things, not really focusing on the particular like practical aspects of things. So celebrity endorsements basically is like the the thought that I would like respond, or I would be more likely to be persuaded into doing something just because um just because that there's a celebrity I like that is endorsing that thing. So continuing into talking about social psychology, central root persuasion offers evidence and arguments to trigger favorable thoughts. So instead of celebrity endorsements, this is something like over-the-counter medicine ads that we've all probably seen before on TV that have incredibly long descriptions of the side effects of their medication. These things are more factual, but if they say things about like how the medicine works and how it will battle sickness, like talking about things like pathogens and just like scientific things, then we would be more likely to be persuaded into purchasing that medicine because of the fact that it's presenting facts and scientific evidence. So external pressures can override attitudes that affect behavior as well. So an important vocabulary word that is definitely going to probably come up soon, if not on this test, then definitely on the AP exam, is the foot in the door phenomenon, which is the tendency to agree with small requests and comply later with large ones. So essentially, if I were to go up to my friend and ask them today for just $1, then later I would be like, I would continue to ask them every day for an increase in that amount. So like today would be $1, tomorrow would be maybe would be $2, and then the day after would be $3. And then if the day after that I ask for maybe $10, then they would be more likely to do that because to them the increments don't seem high enough for them to be like, oh, that's too much money. And this is because moral action strengthens moral conviction. And so on the other side of this, there is something called the door in the face phenomenon, which is the tendency to agree with the semi-large request first by first requesting something big to then give someone the illusion that the other request is smaller. So this would be an example of this would be if I were to ask my parents to buy me a Porsche for my birthday, right? And then they would be like, no, because that's a ridiculous request. And then instead later I'll ask them for maybe an iPad or something because in comparison to a Porsche, an iPad is a much smaller request, even though on its own it is a pretty large request. In front of the Porsche, it seems like something small, and so then they would be more likely to agree to that request. Roles are norms defining how those in a social position should behave. So a great example of this is the Stanford prison experiment, which is definitely something important when learning about social psychology. If you guys haven't, you guys are probably familiar with it, but if you're not, then essentially they they put two groups of people in different situations. They had one group of people fill the role of like police officers and like prison guards, and the other group of people fill the role of the prisoners. And so they found that in this situation, although they were all normal people, they all came from the same background, similar demographics. Um, they found that the people who were prison guards were became a lot more violent and essentially felt more superior to those who were prisoners, even though they were not truly prison guards or prisoners. It's just the situation that they were put in and the roles that they were given. And that's how it like caused them to behave in a certain way. So the cognitive dissonance theory is Leon Festinger's theory that we act to reduce inconsistencies in our actions and attributes. We become motivated to change attitudes to justify dissonant actions, and changing behavior can change our thoughts and feelings. Okay, so the next module, here are some important facts about it. So the chameleon effect is mimicking by watching someone do something and copying it, which is also known as automatic mimicry. And as humans, we tend to do something after someone else does, which can explain why different friends all indulge in the same activities. So this is also a great example of why high schoolers and teenagers are very susceptible to influence from their peers and people around them is because of this thing called chameleon effect. So if you had like friends of yours who were really into something like alcohol or drugs, then you would definitely be more likely to do something that they were doing because of the chameleon effect and automatic mimicry. So a really important concept here in social psychology unit is conformity, and that is adjusting our behavior or thoughts to coincide with the group standard. And a great example of this is the Solomon Asch study, where he showed three lines. He showed a line that was a certain length, and he showed three other lines that were either smaller, larger, or the same length as that line. And he asked a room of people to choose what the correct, which line matched the original one. And most of the people there were working with him and were told to say the wrong answer. And there was one person in the room who was like an actual test subject. Um, and so this person, they found that people were more likely to conform to saying the wrong answer when all the other people who were told to say the wrong answer did. And so that just proves like a big aspect of social psychology is conformity. And we are more likely to conform with groups when we feel incompetent in comparison. Everyone else agrees with something and knowing that others will observe us. So just trying to get social acceptance is like a big factor to push people to conform. Normative social influence is the influence you conform to from desire to gain approval and avoid rejection. So social norms are understood rules for expected and accepted behaviors in society, and people need to belong, so they are sensitive to social norms. So this is very similar to what I talked about in the Solomon Asch conformity study. Um, Basically, this the test subject for each of the rooms was really interested in gaining approval and avoiding rejection, and so they were more likely to conform to what everyone else was saying, even if they knew it was wrong. Informational social influence is influenced by willingness to accept others' opinions. So another great study that is very important is the Milgram study, which showed that people obeyed commands even if they knew people were being hurt. And this is because of obedience to authority figures. So this is something that points towards political power, especially because as we know, like political figures are very influential and are very powerful. So there are a lot of people that will follow the things they say and do, even if it's wrong and even if it will hurt people because of the fact that they are authority figures and people are have a tendency to be obedient. Okay, so for Module 76, social facilitation is improved performance on simple tasks in the presence of others, and inversely, people perform worse on harder tasks in the presence of others. So if you were with others and you were trying to show off this cool talent you have, you would probably be more likely to do it and better at doing it if you were in the presence of an audience or if you were in the presence of others. But if you were doing something extremely hard that you've never done before in the presence of others, then you'd probably be more likely to fail on it because of the pressure that you're feeling and the stress that you're getting from these people watching you. Social loafing is the tendency for people in a group to exert less effort than as an individual, and this can be caused by people worrying less about what others think, viewing individual contributions as dispensable, and free riding on others because of equal benefit. So the best example of this that probably happens in all of us, all of our daily lives, is when people in group projects and group situations, there will usually be one or two people who don't do much work and it's because as an individual, they think that their effort won't be as much since there are other people in the group who could do more effort. De-individuation is the loss of self-restraint due to anonymity. So this creates more aroused behaviors like crimes. So for example, Halloween is a big night every year where there are crimes and a lot of kind of crazy, unconventional stuff happening. And it's because of the fact that a lot of people wear masks and a lot of people are anonymous to others on the street. Group polarization is the enhancement of a group's prevailing inclinations through discussion, and this can reinforce both good and bad things.
Grace, we have a question in the chat. What's the difference between conformity and groupthink?
Okay, so conformity is essentially when you're in a social situation and you are trying to like either receive approval or avoid rejection. And so in order to do that, you will conform to essentially like what others are thinking and what others may be doing. So a great example of this is peer pressure. Let's say you're in a social situation with like you're at a party, like a high school party, and everyone there is drinking alcohol, even though it's wrong. In order to be accepted or to avoid rejection, you will go and drink alcohol as well, just to like conform with the rest of the group. And so let me quickly go over the definition of groupthink and then I'll answer why it's different than conformity. So groupthink is the desire for harmony in decision making overriding realistic appraisal in a group, which usually happens with rational decisions. So basically, groupthink is more tame, in my opinion, than conformity. And it's more like when you're in a situation and you're trying to make a decision about something, like let's say you guys are planning on where you want to go for a trip, maybe. Maybe like on your own, like if you were alone, you would think about maybe going on a road trip to Lake Tahoe or something. But then because you're in a group and you all like kind of want to keep harmony and you kind of want to like lift each other up, that's more of like then you would be more likely to make like a trip across the sea and make it like, oh, Japan or like India or something like that. So it's a little bit different in the sense where conformity is more like societal, like social situations that are more like at a larger level, and groupthink is more of like a smaller level where you're trying to make a decision together. I'm sorry if that doesn't make sense, but I tried my best. So, yeah. Um,
That was great.
okay, cool. All right. So then culture is the behaviors and traditions shared by a group and is passed on to generations, and it can greatly impact our behavior. So everyone knows what culture is, but this is also a big part of social psychology because the type of culture you're in can greatly impact some of your decisions and the way you act in social situations as well. So, like a great example of this is I'm sure many of us are immigrants or at least children of immigrants. And so, like, even though we're growing up in America, the culture here is extremely different than the cultures in the Eastern cultures. So, China, India, Japan, Korea, whatever it is. And so, it might be difficult for us to act in social situations in other countries because of the fact that we are very used to the culture here in America. Okay, so then for Module 77, prejudice is prejudgment towards groups based on stereotypes, which are generalized beliefs, and ethnocentrism is assuming superiority of one's own ethnic group. So a great example of this is white supremacy. Discrimination is negative behavior towards a group of people, which can be a result of prejudice. Discrimination and prejudice are big things that happen in terms of race, sex, religion, color, those types of social demographics are targets of these sorts of phenomena. So the just world phenomenon is the belief that the good get rewarded while the bad get punished, but this can create poor assumptions that the successful are good while strugglers are bad. So something that can kind of put this into perspective is that um, a lot of the times, especially people living in the area that we live in here in Fremont, a lot of the times people will assume that the homeless like deserve to be homeless because either they didn't work hard or they might have fallen into the trap of doing things like drugs or whatever. And whereas people might believe that the successful CEOs worked hard and were able to get where they are at that point and they deserve that. So, it's kind of an unfair thing. Like I said, it can create poor assumptions because it might be the opposite where the homeless person was just a victim to social systems and the person who is at the top and is actually a pretty bad person to his workers. So we have a tendency as humans to favor those who are familiar to us, which is another tendency of ours. And so this leads to the idea of the in group, which are the people who we share a common identity with. And then there's the out group, who are the people who are different from our in group. And so in group bias is the tendency to favor our own group. So, for example, if you were in PE, in middle school, and you were choosing people to be part of your team, in some sort of sport, you would tend to probably pick either your friends or people who are more similar to you than people who are in the out group, in your opinion. So, scapegoat theory is prejudice that offers us an outlet for anger by getting someone to blame. And we simplify the world by categorizing based on perceptions, which can lead to stereotyping. The other race effect is recalling faces of one's own race more accurately, and this was based on a study that was done. Not exactly very important, but this effect is important to know because I'm sure we're all very familiar with our own races more, and so that's why we are able to recall faces of our own race more accurately. So Module 28 is a pretty small one, but here are a couple points from there. Aggression is physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt or destroy. And the frustration aggression principle is that frustration creates anger, which can lead to aggression. And then the last point is that social scripts are culturally modeled guides for how to act in various situations, and this can be impacted by any behavior that you observe. So essentially, we are more likely to, because this goes back to the social norms thing, how you act in society. So social scripts can be essentially if I were to accidentally drop my phone on the floor, how would I act in that situation, right? Would I get mad and would I take my phone or hit the wall or something? Or would I get upset and cry? Those are generally the types of questions you would have about social scripts. And this can be impacted by any behavior that you observe. So whether it's your parents or movies or basically any observation you make can impact your social scripts. So then module 79 is that the three principles of attraction are similarity, proximity, and reciprocity. Sorry. The mere exposure effect is a big part of the proximity part, and it says that repeated exposure to novel stimuli increases your liking of it. So, let's say I were to look at the same thing every day, even if it's the ugliest thing I've ever seen, you kind of develop an attachment to that object because you see it so often. And then physical attraction also plays an important role because it can give a good sense of people. So a big part about social psychology is first impressions. You can learn a lot about a lot of people, and you can form interesting relationships with people simply based on the first impressions that they make on you. So passionate love is an aroused state of intense positive absorption in another, and companionate love is deep attachment for those with whom our lives are intertwined. So passionate love is something that usually comes at the beginning of a relationship. A lot of people call it the honeymoon phase, which is basically like, right, the passionate love that you feel. And companionate love usually comes like at the end, like towards the end of relationships, where you form more of that deep connection with people instead of just the material like passionate state you have. That's why most couples might not last after the honeymoon phase, is because they don't develop that companionate love. And then equity is people receiving in proportion to what they give in a relationship. And this is the key to lasting, like long lasting relationships. And it's because generally, as people, like when we give something, we expect something in the same proportion in return. And then self disclosure is revealing intimate aspects of oneself to others. And this is something that is vital for relationships and vital to develop that companionate love. So then the last module is about altruism, which is the unselfish regard for the welfare of others. And basically it's doing things just for the sake of helping other people and not just for your own selfish gain or not expecting anything in return. And then the diffusion of responsibility is when more people share responsibility to help, and so you are more likely to say that it is not your responsibility to help. And this goes to the bystander effect, which is the tendency to be less likely to help if others are present, especially in situations where someone might be in need of help and there are lots of people around, there's a crowd around, and so you feel that you don't need to help. An example of this is essentially, I'm not sure, I can't really recall the name of the person right now, but there was a person who was murdered in New York City, a woman, and like she was screaming really loudly, and it was in the middle of the night, and lots of people in the building next to her heard her screaming and even like turned on the lights and called the police or whatever, but nobody went out to check. And most of the people who were asked why said that it's because they thought somebody else would do it. So that's a great example of the diffusion of responsibility, is that because they expect somebody else to do something, they don't do it themselves. So social exchange theory is social behavior goal is that the social behavior goal is to maximize benefits and minimize costs. So we are more likely to do something because we feel that it will maximize the benefits and minimize the costs when we do them. Then the we are going back to the last module where we talked about the three um, aspects of love, which is essentially similarity, proximity, and then reciprocity. I don't really know how to pronounce it, but hopefully that was right. And so the reciprocity norm is the expectation that people will help those who help them in return. So we talked about that with equity. And then this compels us to give because we expect something in return. Then the social responsibility norm is the expectation that people will help those who need it, because this is aligned with their social norms or their social responsibilities. Okay, so then conflict is perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or ideas between people. Social trap is conflicting parties being caught in mutually destructive behavior by pursuing self-interest rather than that of the group. Mirror image perceptions are mutual views by conflicting people, and the self-fulfilling prophecy is a belief that leads to its own fulfillment. So one of the last important experiments is Muzaffar Sharif's experiment, brought brought about the idea of superordinate goals. So superordinate goals are shared goals that override differences and require cooperation. So in order to explain this experiment, essentially he grouped together two different groups of boys and essentially put them like in isolation, and they ended up like kind of fighting with each other, and like, yeah, essentially they fought with each other and they were very separated among their own respective groups. But then the experimenter gave them a common goal to share. I think it was something about building a house or whatever. And so they had to come together, and because they had a common goal, it overrided their differences and then it required cooperation. Okay, so that was basically a review of most of the basic material that you should know for your social psychology test. So now here's a master list of some key vocabulary that you probably, even if it doesn't come up on this test, will definitely come up on the AP exam. So if you guys want to take a screenshot or a picture of this, you can do that really quickly.
Yeah, definitely make sure that you know how to define these terms and also how to apply it. Grace did a great job with her examples.
Thank you. Okay, cool.
Oh yeah,
So,
there's a new question for you, Grace.
oh,
Yeah. What is the difference between social and clinical psychologists?
okay. So social psychology, I can quickly go back to that slide. So social psychology is the study of how we act differently by focusing on situations. So social psychologists are solely focused on learning about different situations and how people act and behave in different situations, how situations may impact the way we think, how like relationships may impact the way we think and behave. Those sorts of things are what social psychologists will study. Whereas clinical psychologists work with abnormal psych. I'm not sure if you guys have done that unit yet, but abnormal psych is basically looking at things like mental disorders and therapies in order to treat mental disorders. So clinical psychologists usually deal with patients who are suffering from mental disorders, and social psychologists usually do research into how the situation impacts the way humans behave. Okay, so now we're gonna go into some practice questions. I know you guys um, have 5 minutes, but these are super simple MCQ questions that we can do really quickly. So if you guys want, like, please send your answers into the chat of what you think the answer to each of these questions is. So, which pioneer of social psychology conducted a famous conformity experiment requiring subjects to match lines? Was this A. Ansel Keys, B. Sigmund Freud, C. William James, D. Solomon Asch, or E. Alfred Binet? You can either put your answer in the chat or unmute and try to answer it. Okay, yeah. So the answer is actually um, D. Solomon Ash. Like we talked before, I talked about before about the situation in which people were in like a room and they're like they were like the only test subject and there were a bunch of other people who were told to say the wrong answer on purpose to see if people would conform and actually agree and say the wrong answer. Um, so that was Solomon Ash's experiment. Okay. So then number two, which of the following is an example of the fundamental attribution error? Mr. Brady is unsure whether the cause of Cassie's misbehavior is due to poor parenting or her psychiatric illness. B. Jamie sees people as generally good people who have benevolent intentions. C. Madison attributes her good grades to studying hard. D. Marcus tripped in the hallway and assumes the other person deliberately tried to trip him. Or E. After Johnny and James have a discussion on the meaning of life, their original viewpoints converge closer together. Okay. So this is D. Mark is tripped in the hallway and assumes the other person deliberately tried to trip him. And this is because although C could seem correct, the fundamental attribution error is basically saying that we attribute experiences and behaviors more towards individual characteristics and like the personality of people rather than the situation. So C is more attributing her good grades to like herself, but it's because we talked about how people are more likely to just like if they do something bad, they blame it on the situation. So that's not exactly a fundamental attribution error. It's more like D, where Mark is tripped in the hallway and assumes the other person deliberately tried to trip him, because it could be that the situation, like maybe it was really crowded and the person wasn't aware of where their like foot was or something. So this answer would be D. Milgram's famous shock experiment demanded obedience from his participants and demonstrated the existence of what psychological phenomena? The power of social learning, the power of reinforcement, the power of motivation, the power of peer pressure, or the power of authority? Yeah, this is right. This is E, the power of authority. If we remember, they were more likely to shock the people that were on the other side if they were listening to someone who was an authority. Okay, the reduction of a sense of responsibility when individuals are in a group is called A, psychodynamic, B, selective attention, C, diffusion of responsibility, D, displacement, or E, bystander effect. Yeah, so this is C, diffusion of responsibility. That's correct. Um, Essentially, this is similar to the bystander effect, but the bystander effect is more specific into like situations where there's someone who is in need and there's like a crowd around them of people who are trying to help them or not trying to help them. Who was the head researcher behind the Stanford Prison Experiment? Philip Zimbardo, Solomon Asch, Abraham Maslow, Karen Horney, or Sigmund Freud? Yeah, this is right. So this is Philip Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Experiment. We talked about the cops and the prisoners and the people who were put in those roles and why they acted differently. Okay, I believe this is the last question if I'm not wrong. Oops. Okay, I guess I kind of accidentally put the answer. But yeah, the bystander effect is the likelihood of an individual in distress receiving assistance decreasing if the crowd around him is large. And we talked about the diffusion of responsibility. So this is basically that, but in terms, like a specific terms. So we're gonna skip the FRQ practice because your guys' test is just MCQ, so it's unnecessary. Here is like a link to the study guide that Stephanie put into the chat at the beginning. It's a lot more in depth than this presentation. This was more to just give you guys a general idea of how it will go. Um, our one-on-one tutoring program is also open. If you guys need one-on-one support in AP Psychology, we have some great tutors who are definitely willing to help, and it will help you get a 5 on the AP exam and an A in the class.